So when we last left our historical process here, Islam had come on the scene and was posing a challenge, particularly to the Eastern Church, to the Orthodox Church in Constantinople, because of the physical proximity. And Islam had a really successful first century. They conquered a lot of territory during that time, both on the Arabian Peninsula and then up to the shores of the Mediterranean there, and started pressing against Asia Minor, Turkey and Armenia and those areas around that way, but then also across North Africa and up to Spain. They became the ruling presence in Spain early in the 8th century, in the 700s. So Europe was kind of in a pincer a little bit. And it is not until the defeat of the Muslim forces at Tours by Charles Martel that Europe kind of defines its borders, and you get the area into which Islam is not ultimately going to penetrate, which is the continent beyond Spain as we think of it today. But meanwhile, the Western Church, headed by the city of Rome and the Bishop of Rome, continues to divide off from the rest of the Christian church in the East, whose capital is now Constantinople. Everybody kind of remembering that happening. So there came to be a lot of tension between those two cities, between Rome and Constantinople. They're kind of going. Angie, are you trying to get my attention? You're muted. Hey, Angie, is she trying to tell us something? I don't know. Okay, well, hopefully she'll figure it out. All right. Oh, maybe someone is calling her about how to get into the group or something. Anyway, so there was a lot of tension between who's really in charge here. And remember, early on, as the church emerged from those first decades of missionary activity, like in the 100s, the 5 cities, right, the pentarchy, as they call it, of Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. Those were the 5. Well, by the time Constantinople came along, those were the 5 major centers. And so now that the Roman Empire has fallen in the city of Rome, Constantinople does not think that the Roman Empire has fallen. They think it's just moved its capital, right? So the question of who is in charge politically and who is in charge of the church is one that continues to remain up in the air now towards the end of the first millennium, in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries here. So on the one hand, you have the Bishop of Rome, who, because he's in charge of pretty much all of Europe, believes that he's in charge of the whole church, that he is the head guy, and everybody else is that's in some way subordinate to him. Now you have the Bishop of Constantinople, who thinks, well, Rome is a lost cause, but the rest of us, the remaining 4, we're all in it together. And by the way, I'm in charge of the remaining 4. I'm in charge of that territory. I'm in charge of that part of the church. So he begins to call himself the ecumenical patriarch, the father of the household, basically, which is that remaining group of 4 head churches. There was also an issue in terms of liturgical practice, well, there were several issues about what creed was recited and where in the service, but also the Roman Church, the Western Church, began using unleavened bread in the Eucharist, in the worship communion service. And if any of you have been to a Roman Catholic church or even high liturgy Protestant church, you usually think of communion as a little cracker, right? A little dried piece of unleavened bread, right? That's what we're used to. And in the United States, it was a big innovation when people started going back to having real bread, that is to say, leavened, risen bread. That was kind of a new thing. Well, over in the East, they always had unleavened, they always had leavened bread. They always had risen bread, yeast bread, as the vehicle for communion. And it was interesting. They accused the Romans, the Westerners, of going back to Judaism, because what's the story about Passover, right? That they had to leave so fast that they could not allow the bread to rise, right? So on Passover, you eat unleavened bread as part of remembering that process. Whereas the Eastern Church claimed the bread that Jesus had at the Last Supper would have been yeast bread, would have been risen bread. There would have been no reason for it to be unleavened. And therefore, in our communion, this is part of what differentiates us from Judaism, right? Jews have unleavened bread and we Christians have risen bread. So that was kind of a contentious thing that was more important than you might think. Yes, Anna.
Sorry to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
You said that the reason the Jews used unleavened bread was because they had to leave. Can you tell about that a little bit? Because I don't remember that part.
Sure. So remember, Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go," and they're trying to get away from the Egyptians who are oppressing them and making slaves out of them, right? And so he starts doing the series of plagues. There's a plague of locusts and there's a plague of frogs and there's a plague, and each time Pharaoh says, "Well, yeah, that's impressive." And the idea is that, see how powerful our God is. You don't want to be on his bad side, so you should let us go out and worship him, which is the theory of what they're going to do. And each time Pharaoh says, "Yeah, that's impressive, but I'm still not going to let you go." And so the last one is that God is going to kill the firstborn child in each household and among all the herds and flocks too. So this is going to be a major personal economic disaster, right? So he says to the Hebrews, you do this worship sacrifice and put the blood of a lamb, mark your doorway, sort of like Jews live here, kind of, with the blood of this lamb, and we will pass over that house. That's Passover, right? Okay, so that happens. And so Pharaoh's kind of up in the middle of the night because this is a disaster. And so he calls Moses and he says, "Get out, just get out right now." And so Moses says, "All right, you don't have to tell us twice, right? We're out of here, we're gone." And so it's like, everybody, just take what you have, we're going. And so in the normal course of the day, you would make the bread in the morning, it would rise, and then you would bake it in the afternoon. Oh. But they didn't have time to do that. So they just, like a pancake or something, they just threw it on the stove and baked it right now. And so it didn't have time to rise and be fluffy, the way we think bread is. That's the story. I am not claiming historical validity for that mythology.
I just didn't know. That's great. Yeah. Thank you.
So when the idea was, when you see unleavened bread, it's supposed to make you think of that event. And so for some people, if you're Christian, that's not your story. That's not your event. That's not what you're trying to remember. You're trying to remember Jesus in the Last Supper, and he would have had, a baguette or something, so it would have been a different kind of bread. So anyway, although I think part of the point was that the unleavened bread is easier to store and transport. Yes, Al.
So But wasn't the Last Supper supposed to be a Passover?
That's arguable. It was the Passover season, but it wasn't the Passover meal.
Ah, okay.
So now, see, theoretically, you shouldn't have yeast in your house for Passover, but I think that came later. But you were supposed to serve unleavened bread at the Passover meal. But I think the whole thing, and Margaret, you might know more about this, or anybody who has a little Jewish in their background, when it became a thing that you don't have yeast in the house at all for a period of time, right? I don't remember.
It was
exactly.
probably during the rabbinic law period.
Yeah, exactly. They may, and because their idea was you expand a little on either side to make sure that you don't violate the core thing. But anyway, and it may not, that may not even, they may have had unleavened bread at the Last Supper, and that this is just the Eastern Church's interpretation. But they did, what we do know is that the Eucharist started with leavened bread. That originally it was part of a meal, and then as it becomes more and more ceremonial, it kind of shrinks down until you get the little, the teeny little cup with the little sip of wine and the cracker in the package, that it sort of gets reified down to that. But anyway, that was one of the differences that led to them calling each other heathens and unbelievers because you use leavened bread and I don't. I mean, it was just silly, but it was a thing. But then the theological contention was about whether or not the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone, or whether it proceeds from Jesus and the Father. I mean, I love a good theological controversy, and I cannot wrap my head around this one. It's just so obscure. But it has to do with, is the Trinity something that is present in the universe at the time of creation, or do the pieces of it come into being? So if Jesus proceeds from God and then the Holy Spirit proceeds from God and Jesus, that argues sort of a sequential process. And it basically means that Jesus and the Holy Spirit are not equivalent to God the Father. And the Romans, the Western Church, were much more obsessed with the nature of the Trinity. And so their contention was, no, as soon as God comes into being, it's all three pieces, all at the same time. So therefore, the Holy Spirit does not proceed from Jesus. Go figure. But anyway, so that was part of what they were fussing about. Peggy, was that a hand or just a, okay, all right. So the bottom line is there were a lot of issues. There were always issues about power. There were always issues about money. There were always issues about government. And then there were some of these sort of practical questions that they divided along those lines about. It's also worth noticing that, I don't know if you remember, but we talked about the Little Ice Age and the way that affected the climate. And this is sort of the reverse. Between 950 and 1250, the archaeological climatologists tell us, you have the medieval climate optimum, is what they call it, which was a period of global warming. And what the impact of that was that it increased the yields of European agriculture. It increased their ability to raise animals, and it increased their crop production. It had the opposite impact on the Arabian Peninsula and in the Middle East, was that it caused droughts. It got warmer there, and they didn't need it to be any warmer. So you have to read all of this military and governmental stuff with that happening in the background, in terms of who had food and who didn't. Okay, so in 1049, we get Pope Leo IX. And he was a reformer pope, he's called. He was also from Germany. So he was not a native, what we would call today Italian. He was not someone from the hereditary Roman Empire. He was a German, and he felt like the Pope should have lots of authority, but the Pope should use that authority to enforce conformity among the churches and among the priests. So he was one of the ones who contributed to the establishment of celibacy for all clergy. They'd kind of been going down the path where bishops, maybe church leaders, should be celibate, or if their wife died, they should not remarry, or, you know, I mean, there was a push in that direction, but it wasn't just categorically applied to everybody in the church. And that was something that Leo IX wanted to do. He wanted all clergy to be celibate, and he wanted clergy and people of church authorities to no longer in any context have popular election be part of that. Only the church could create a priest or a bishop. And if you remember before, that was a little more complicated process where really the bishop had to be somebody who had at least popular endorsement, or it wasn't going to work. And as far as Leo's concerned, the Pope has to make the bishop, and the bishop has to make the priest, and the congregation has nothing to say about it. So that was also part of his reform vision. He also creates what we know today as the College of Cardinals, you know, that group that is sort of the next level down from the Pope. The bishop, all bishops had always had a bishop's council, basically sort of a cabinet of assistants, people who helped them. But for what Leo does, gives his group of advisors authority over all the other bishops in the Western Church. So now you have priests, bishops, cardinals, and the Pope. So no other bishop has cardinals. They can have advisors, but they don't have, these guys have more authority than anybody else's does. And he also is one of the people who grounds his authority in the donation of Constantine. And we've talked about the donation of Constantine a little bit before. Remember that Pepin of France, when he was fighting with the Lombards in what we now know as Italy, he found that he couldn't keep the territory that he conquered because it was too far away. He couldn't manage to administer and defend it. So instead, he gave it to the Pope. He donated it to the Pope, and that's where we get the Papal States, in that little strip up in northern Italy. And that really did happen. That's a historical reality. And so that made the Pope a secular prince. It gave him property, it gave him income, it gave him people that he could draft into his own military force. It was a great advantage. So along about the 9th century, the Western Church started to say, that was a great idea, Pepin, but you were a little late on the scene. What if Constantine had made a donation like that, all the way back in the 300s, right? And so they created one, they forged one basically, and said, okay, Pepin was great, but the thing that really gives the Bishop of Rome secular authority was the fact that Constantine gave it to the guy that was Bishop of Rome in his day. Gave him secular authority over the city, because what did Constantine do? He moved to Constantinople, right? And so it would have made sense that he would have turned over authority in Rome to somebody else. And as it happened in this legend, who he turned it over to was the Bishop of Rome. So that, therefore, says Leo IX, I am not only the religious authority, I'm also the secular authority. And so when that document, the donation of Constantine, is proven to be a forgery, that's going to throw the whole Roman Church into a bit of a cocked hat. But this is when it started to become promulgated as a source of the Pope's authority. All right, makes sense. So Leo the Ninth is somewhat of an innovator, and he's not exactly a power grabber, but he's a power consolidator. You know, he wants to make all this stuff organized and orderly and recognized, so that, you know, going forward, we all know who's in charge, and that's me. Now, one of the things that he tries to do as he is trying to get all his ducks in a row is he says, okay, now remember that the Byzantine Empire has come through and militarily reconquered some of the territory in what is now Italy, right? So that the emperor of Byzantium has territories in Italy, and therefore the religious leadership in Byzantium, the Bishop of Constantinople and other powerful people in the church, have built churches within the former Western Roman Empire that are Byzantine churches, right? And Peggy can talk to us a little bit about this architecturally, you know, what that meant. They actually imported workmen, right, from the East to build those churches and make them look like
Eastern Church, right? This started with Justinian, and when they were pushed out, they were never completely pushed out. They still controlled a lot of southern Italy,
right.
And the churches in that area, basically, they're domed churches, like where Western churches are not centralized domed churches. That's just not the Western style, but it's the Eastern style, yeah.
So not only did they build these churches, they appointed the priests and the functionaries, the people who made these churches work. Well, if you are in an Eastern architectural church with an Eastern staff, what kind of bread do you think you're serving for communion? You're serving risen bread, right? So you're following the Eastern rite. You're following the way they do it in Constantinople and in Byzantium. Leo was not impressed. Leo said, look, either you start doing this the way that I, the Bishop of Rome, say to do it, and the way we do it in the Western Roman churches, or we're going to close you down. You know, if you want to close down your church and go back to Constantinople, go back to Antioch or wherever you'd like to be in the Byzantine world, that's okay. They didn't make martyrs. They didn't want to make martyrs. And in actual fact, it doesn't look like he ever closed churches, but he ordered them to stop doing it the Byzantine way and start doing it the Western way, or he was going to close them. Okay, so the Bishop of Constantinople got wind of this, because of course the priests that he supervises are writing to him saying, what are we supposed to do? You know, how do you want us to handle this? And he does. He says, well, that's fine. We have a bunch of Western churches operating here in our city, and they're now closed. They're done. They're gone. Bye. So he kicked out all of those priests and closed down those churches. And so that was another move in the conflict, you know, of separating, whereas before you had both kinds of churches operating, you know, sometimes not that far away from each other. Now you have this sort of hard line drawn about how the liturgy is going to be. And that creates a lot of ill feeling among the members of the churches, and especially the priests and the leaders of the churches. So then in 1054, and this is one of our big red letter dates, right, that some of us already know, Leo sends a, an embassy to Constantinople. He sends a group to go and meet with the emperor and his counterpart, the Bishop of Constantinople, who's a guy named Cerularius. I hope that's how you pronounce it, because I don't know that I've ever heard it spoken. But anyway, he wants to do two things. He has a military agenda, which is approved by the secular authorities in Rome, which is that they need to do something about the Lombards. Remember, these are the northern pagans who were kind of pushing down into Italy and attacking them, and also the Normans who were coming over from England and the north, trying to conquer territory in Italy, partly because their leadership is so disorganized. It's not that hard to do. So Leo is like, you know what? It's in your interest to send us aid, to send us military forces, to send us money to resist these people, because as soon as they get done with Italy, you know, you're next on the list, right? So you should help us out, right? So he wants to set up this joint military force. But the other thing he wants to do is to say, and by the way, you need to recognize me as the supreme leader of the Christian church. You are taking way too much authority with this whole ecumenical patriarch thing. I don't know what that is, but it's not okay. And so he's demanding the submission of Cerularius, and also trying to set up this joint military project. Apparently, the guy he sent, Humbert is the name of his ambassador, the guy who was in charge of this mission, was not particularly diplomatic, was not particularly tactful. And so when Cerularius says, well, you know, the military project sounds good, but no, I'm not going to recognize you as the, you know, final authority head of the church, Humbert, on behalf of, in the name of Leo IX, excommunicates Cerularius, excommunicates the Bishop of Constantinople and his sort of inner circle of advisors and priests. Now, he does not excommunicate all the members of the Eastern Church. He does not excommunicate the civil authority, the emperor or the army, because guess what? He still needs those people. But he does excommunicate the religious leadership. And Cerularius, I think not unnaturally, turns around and says, oh yeah, well, I excommunicate you too. So the interesting thing is that between the time that Humbert left Rome, got to Constantinople, had all these dialogues, and ultimately excommunicated Cerularius, Leo IX, in whose name he was doing this, has died. So there's a big question as to whether this excommunication is even valid, you know, even has any effect, because the guy in whose name he's doing it, unbeknownst to him, is dead. But when Cerularius excommunicates Humbert, and by extension, Leo and the other folks that are working with him, that we know is valid because Cerularius does it in his own name. I mean, he is the bishop, he's the guy. So his is clearly valid and effective, whether or not Humbert's actually was. So this is the traditional date of the institutional separation between the Eastern and the Western churches. So from now on, you're going to have the Western Roman Catholics and you're going to have the Greek-speaking Eastern Orthodox. Okay, and it's fair to speak of two different churches, two different ecclesiastical organizations, and two different theologies to some extent. Yes, Anna.
Where did the word Catholic come in?
Catholic. That's a good question, because what Catholic meant originally was universal. So if you say, I am the Catholic Pope, that means I'm the universal Pope. This is the universal church. This is, and what it comes to mean is, this is the church that God wants everyone to have, right? This is the one true church, as they will come to call it. And anybody who calls themselves a Christian but is not part of this church is not a legitimate Christian. That was not language that they were using at this moment, but it will come to be called that. Okay, so that's 1054, just after the turn of the millennium. You get that formal split. It's been coming for centuries, right? But now it's here in a certain way. Now, this didn't necessarily have a lot of impact on ordinary people. It was more seen as sort of a inner squabble and among power factions in the church to most people, even to a lot of secular authorities. So some of this other stuff that we're going to talk about for a few minutes is what is going to seal that separation, right? In 1054, it would have still been possible to put the toothpaste back in the tube. And in point of fact, this was not the first time that this happened. There had been mutual excommunications before, there had been theological differences before, and somehow they patched it up, like often happens in lots of denominations and has happened in the Catholic Church many times since then. So at that moment, no one necessarily knew that this was anything other than a footnote, right? But it will become much more than a footnote because of things that will happen after this. So questions, or let me stop there and make sure we're all sort of caught up with this. Okay. So if you remember, shortly after the death of Muhammad back in the 600s, the Muslim forces began taking over territory, or reclaiming territory, as they would have called it, on the Arabian Peninsula and in the Middle East. And so fairly early on in that process, they captured Jerusalem in 636 and Alexandria over in Egypt in 641. So when you think about it, these two churches have hardly been part of the equation for several hundred years now. There remain Christian churches in those two cities, but they are no longer sources of economic or military power to the Byzantine Empire. Does that make sense? That they're in Muslim hands in terms of financially, in terms of as a military power base or a source of recruitment, or a source of imported food or anything like that. Also, because of the climate change thing, they're struggling a little more. I mean, if you remember, during the early Roman Empire, northern Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome. They imported a huge amount of food to Rome. They're not in a position to do that anymore. So really, you have Constantinople and Antioch out of the five, right? Because Rome is going to go be its own church. Jerusalem and Alexandria have fallen to the Muslims. And so what's left is Constantinople and Antioch. They're kind of in the middle there between Rome on the west and these other two on the south, basically. In 1085, so 31 years after that mutual excommunication, which is a short period of time in these days, I mean, because communication is so slow and everything, Antioch falls to the Muslim Turks. So that is traumatic. They'd gotten used to Jerusalem and Alexandria, but now part of what is considered an essential part of that Eastern Greek church has been taken over by the Muslims. And so that's now they're worried, right? I mean, that's a new revolting development when that happens. So yes,
What is Antioch now?
it's still Antioch.
Antioch.
Oh, what, I mean, you mean what religion is it?
And where is it? Like exactly?
It's in Turkey, right?
Turkey. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Is it Muslim?
To some extent. There are also Christians still in Antioch. It's still a Christian pilgrimage site. There's a Jewish community in Antioch, which there always was from, you know, before Christianity ever even existed. There was a Jewish community in Antioch. So it's an interesting mixture. Although I think probably most of the administration is Muslim at this point. But you know, that's a good question to which I don't totally know the answer. You know, it was part of that westernization, modernization effort with like Ataturk and those guys. They had a vision of becoming part of Western Europe, you know, and I'm not sure how much of that has stuck and how much of that has kind of receded back in the modern Islamic revival. But you can go there. It's a fascinating place, as I understand it. I'd love to see it sometime. Okay, so what happened when the Western Church and Western Empire was being harassed by the Lombards and the Normans? The first thing they thought of doing was going over to the Byzantine Empire and saying, hey, you guys, you might want to help us out here. Well, when Antioch falls to the Muslims in 1085, the Byzantine Empire has the same thought, you know, and so they say to Rome, to the Pope and the Roman authorities, you might want to think about helping us out here because you're next on the list. You know, if these guys go through us, they're coming for you, right? So this is now also remember that by the end of the 11th century, we are more than halfway through the 700 years of Muslim authority in Spain. Always remember there's a Western front to the struggle, right? There's what's happening on the East, in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Arabia, but there's also always Spain. And so there's always a fear that the Muslims are going to kind of come through the back door, right? They're going to come up through Spain and get us too. And so a lot of the Northern and Western Europeans are more worried about Spain than they are worried about what's happening over in Jerusalem or Constantinople. And so they have, to some extent, adopted in these kingdoms that were pagan not all that long ago, right? That had kind of more pagan warrior values than Roman warrior values, if that makes sense. They thought of their gods were warriors, you know, that war was a kind of spiritual valor, if you will, in those pagan cultures. And there's a certain streak of that in Islam too, that if you're defending yourself, then it is a virtue to be a noble and courageous warrior, right? Christianity originally had held participation in war as a sin, right? So in order to be the basis of a Christian spiritual endeavor, they had to do some work. And a lot of that work happened in Northern Christian European countries, where they took the Islamic virtue of war in self-defense and made it a spiritual value. So that you could be a warrior for the kingdom of heaven. You could be a warrior for God, basically. As opposed to it being kind of a secular career move that you might actually have to confess. Now, that didn't stop people from being soldiers, and they confessed all the time to the stuff that they did as soldiers, but the church wasn't promoting it in the same way. That begins to happen first along the contended areas between Spain and France and Northern Europe, where they're constantly trying to beat back the Muslims, and if possible reclaim areas in Spain across the Pyrenees to secure the borders of Christianity, right? So a lot of this cultural redefinition of warfare and religion has already happened in Northern Europe and on the border with Spain. And in order to induce people to continue this constant sort of small scale skirmish warfare, there has started to be this idea that if you die in battle, and Islam is very clear about this, if you die in battle as a martyr to Islam, you don't get judged. You go straight to heaven. So anything you've done, it doesn't matter, right? So Christianity began to play around with that and say, well, this thing that happens when you go to confession and you confess your sins, two things happen. One, you are usually assigned some sort of penance. Most of us who are familiar with confession today, it's you say some prayers, some Hail Marys, or maybe you fast for a day or something, but it's pretty trivial compared to what it used to be. Because you could be imposed with major fasting. You could be instructed to go on pilgrimage. That was one of the penances that you could have to perform. So, maybe it was just over to the next town. You had to go and, make a worship at the shrine of such and such a saint, or, maybe it was that you had to go all the way to the other side of the country. Depends on how rich you were, partly, what might be required of you. And the third thing you could do is make a major contribution to the church. So if you built a shrine, if you added a wing to the local monastery or something, that could also be a form of penance that happened in this world. Yeah, Peggy.
Is it true, I've read, but I don't know if it's true, that the Pope redefined the commandments and said that thou shalt not kill means thou shalt not kill Christians?
Well, whether he ever said Christians or not, I don't know. That's a great question, but I know that there was a process by which it moved. There was some argument about what is the meaning of the commandment. Is it that thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder? Because there are a number of Jewish laws that specify executing people for various offenses, which means that you have to kill them. So there was always some sort of assumption that thou shalt not kill outside of some judicial structure. And so the question was, did that judicial structure include a declared war? And this is why you have people like Augustine exercised about what is a just war. How do you define a war in which it is in fact legitimate for a Christian to kill? And part of what's going to happen here is that Christian isn't going to work anymore. You might have had a period of time when you could say, no Christian should kill another Christian. But once you start having armed conflict between the East and the Western churches, Christian is no longer enough of a definition. Now you're going to have to say, you can't kill another Catholic Christian. And when we get to some of the European wars of succession, even that isn't going to work. So it's a moving target, I guess, is what I would say. But yeah, they had to continually be working out the theological justification for this in their heads. And that's why it's important to know that that process kind of starts more in the West on the Spanish border. And then, so, all right, so you do your penance in this world, and then your sins are forgiven so that you are not punished in the next world, right? So there's basically there's two things that the priest is doing. He's saying, you know, you will do this. He's imposing a penalty now, and then there will not be consequences later, right? So one of the things now that people and you could negotiate, you know, I mean, if somebody said you will fast on Fridays for a year or something, you could say, well, how about if I, you know, donate this field to the monastery? Or how about if I build the new wing that you want on your cathedral, or what, you know, I mean, they were fungible. You could substitute them for one another. So one thing that you could do was to take up arms on behalf of God for a certain period of time. And most wars, especially the ongoing ones, were fought seasonally anyway. So you would go and attack people after your crops were planted in the spring, and then you try to get back home before you got froze solid in the winter. You know, I mean, there was a, and that's how mercenaries were hired, and that's how soldiers who were obligated for service were obligated for a season, basically. And so you could say, I'll go join the army in Spain or wherever for a season, and that'll be my penance. So the idea of pilgrimage and the idea of taking up arms for God or Christ got fused together by Pope Urban II. Kind of take some of these notions that are developing over on the Spanish frontier. And in 1095, he says, okay, look, the forces in Byzantium are clearly inadequate, right? I mean, the part of this is an ego thing for the Westerners. They're having a lot of trouble, tisk, with the Muslims. And, you know, those guys are in the holy city, you know, they're in Jerusalem. And what's with that? Now, interestingly, the Muslims had recognized that Jerusalem was a center of pilgrimage for the Christians. They did not want that to stop. That was an economic benefit for them. So it's not that hard to get into the city. What we need is an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem to throw out these infidels and take the city back. And then that will also, by the way, help the Byzantines. And they, of course, will want to participate with us in doing this because it would be to their benefit. And so then he can say to the Byzantine emperor, okay, we're going to come help you by retaking Jerusalem. That's what we're going to do to help you out, get the infidels out of there. And of course, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, part of the theory of why the rise of Islam was as a consequence from God, because the church was divided and because people were not, you know, playing by the right rules. And so having these forces united would be a demonstration that, okay, God, we got it now, you know, we're going to behave right. And you can make these people, these Muslims, go away. So at this Council of Clermont, Urban II says, let's have an armed pilgrimage. Let's go get this place and take care of things. And anyone who does that, that will be your penance forever, basically. Once you've done that, not only any sin that you've already done, but any sin that you do in the future will be covered by that. And you will be safe. You will be safe in the afterlife, and you will be safe in this life from anything else that you may ever do. Right, so that was partly modeled on the way they were already approaching it in Spain. Although the thing with Spain was it was an ongoing, localized kind of guerrilla, like Vietnam, nothing decisive one way or the other ever. Whereas this is going to be a big to do. It's going to be, we're all going to march over there together, and we're going to do this thing and take care of it, and then it's going to be done. So he has everybody take a vow, that they're going, which you would normally do before you went on a pilgrimage. You would take a vow that you're going to do this pilgrimage for this purpose, to get this blessing or atone for this sin or whatever you were trying to do. So they're all going to take a vow to go to the Holy Land and retake it for Jesus. So that was how the first crusade got organized, and the Pope was at the head of it. I mean, he wasn't going himself, but he was organizing it. He was blessing it. He was giving everybody permission to go. He was giving them all plenary indulgences for going. And they thought this was going to be a one and done, right? We're going to go, we're going to fix it, and then it's going to be over. But think about it yes, Anna.
So going back to the Bible, when these people would declare what you're supposed to do, they would claim that an angel visited them, or they met with God, or Jesus told them, or something, some proof.
Yeah.
And when the popes and bishops are saying, don't worry about it, you'll be absolved for life, is it just their authority?
Yes.
I mean, nobody asks for a proof anymore. They just go with it. And
well, that's why it's important to understand the way that they become the church authority. Those folks in the Bible, they were never rarely were they the head priest or the guy that was in charge of that. They weren't religious authorities. They were some shepherd from out in the hill country who pops up and says, I had a dream and God says this. Nobody knows who that you are. The guy who's running the temple doesn't have to justify himself. He already has that institutional authority. So the popes and the bishops, they already have that institutional authority. Now, come the Reformation, you're going to start seeing that again. Who says you're the boss of me? And I had a revelation, and well, who are you? That argument is going to come back. But for the moment, because you have this very structured, hierarchical church that thinks it's universal, what the top guy says, that kind of goes. And, the other thing is you have a society where most people can't read, but the church people can read. Most people aren't educated, but the church people are educated. So there's this huge assumption that they know what they're talking about, better than you or I do. And plus of which, you don't want to be excommunicated. You don't want to get on their bad side. And they also are hand in glove with the secular government. So, you can suffer legal penalties for things like blasphemy. Those things they're against the law as well as being, frowned upon by God. So there are an awful lot of forces converging to make it so that what the bishop says goes, or what the Pope says goes. Although, as we've seen all along, there are people pushing back against that too. But this era is probably the height of the absolute authority of the church structure. So they in 1096, they set out, and one of the first things that you have to understand is that getting from someplace in northern France to Jerusalem is not a small task. You know, that it takes time and it takes money. And the first crusade is not so bad because a lot of the people who are participating are major powers in their areas. So they have access to whatever resources those areas have. They are pretty well funded because the knights are going and the princes are going and the kings are going. And so they are self-funding. They're bringing their own resources. But they march down to, you know, usually someplace in Italy, although sometimes they leave from French ports too. But at some point, they're going to cross the Mediterranean. The idea of going all the way around through Asia Minor and then back up the coast, that is a long haul, especially if you want to take an army, you know, and horses and stuff like that. So it's much easier to get on a ship at the tip of Italy and sail over. I think they said, I read somewhere that in good weather, you could do it in 15 days. Basically, you could get from Italy to the Middle East. And that, you know, would have taken you months, if not years, to get around by land. So the first thing you need is boats. And apparently that became an issue that not everybody had thought about that the first time around. But they had enough money to make it happen little by little. And so they did actually, by 1099, they recaptured Jerusalem from the Muslim Turks, partly because the Muslims at that point were not particularly well organized or led militarily. So now is where I need you to think about it. Here I am with a bunch of Italian and Northern European elite royal leaders, and we have just taken this city. What are we going to do next? Throw out some ideas. You've gotten rid of the leaders that were there. Now,
Fight about who's going to be the leader now.
well, right. And even if we all have the same idea, who are we picking from? We're picking
our
from
own people.
We're picking from Europeans, right? What kind of Christians are they?
Western
Christians, Roman Christians, right? How does Constantinople feel about Western Christians setting up their own little kingdom in Jerusalem? This is not their idea, right? This is not what they're happy to hear is happening. Now, you're also right that they never really come to a consensus about who ought, of their group, who ought to be in charge. But they do have the consensus that who ought to be in charge is from their group, right? They're not sending to Constantinople saying, who do you think we should put in charge here? So this kingdom of Jerusalem, which is one of the Crusader kingdoms, is what we call them. And the French in the Middle Ages referred to them as outre-mer, over the seas. But basically they are kingdoms administered by Western Christians in the Middle East. And there is one established in Jerusalem. There's also one established in Antioch. So they take back Antioch, but it's the Western Christians who take it back. And so this is a setup. You know, you can kind of see the conflict coming, right, about who is in charge here. Okay, so Alexandria, poor Alexandria, way over there in the west on the north coast of Africa, is part of Egypt, and the Muslims are still in control of Egypt, always will be in control of Egypt. That every now and then, during the 200 years that the Crusader states exist in the Middle East, someone will get the hot notion, let's go take back Alexandria, because it was one of the original 5 Christian cities. They never make it work. They never actually do it. But every once in a while, they sort of trot out and try. So it's one of those ongoing drains of military resources and so on to try to get Alexandria back. But so Alexandria, again, there's a small Christian community there, but they're really not relevant anymore to what's happening in the church. The Western Christians now control Jerusalem and Antioch. So whereas you once had Rome isolated, and then Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, now it's Constantinople that's isolated, right? Because Rome is controlling what's happening. Well, they're more controlling what's happening in Jerusalem and Antioch than Constantinople is anyway. Whether they're actually controlling it or not is a different question. Does that make sense? Does everybody see what's happening in this sort of geopolitical mishigas here? Yes, Anna.
I guess I missed when they took Antioch.
Can I tell you that? It didn't take long, but I'd have to look up the date.
Was it on their way to Jerusalem?
No. They did. Jerusalem was first.
Okay.
Jerusalem, and that's where their base of power for about 100 years is Jerusalem. Now they'll lose Jerusalem first also. But they took Jerusalem first, and then they kind of went up the coast, trying to take back territory. Yeah, Peggy.
Well, I'm wondering why the Byzantines didn't get involved. I mean, couldn't they foresee this if it was only the Westerners fighting? It seems, maybe it's hindsight, but it seems like they weren't thinking about it very well.
Strategically. Yeah, right. The Byzantines are having an interesting process, which is going to be relevant. Just a second here. The Byzantine emperor kept more secular power than the Roman secular authorities did. And the Byzantine emperor became very corrupt. There's a reason why we use the word Byzantine to describe something that's incredibly complicated and hard to understand, right? And that's a reference back to this administrative period when it was very hard to figure out who was in charge, and half the people who were in charge were corrupt and the other half were related to the people who were corrupt. And it was not well organized. And one of the things that they did was they sold off their military resources. They sold off their naval ships, and they sold off the right to control the procurement for the Navy and stuff like that. And so people made individual fortunes, and the quality of their military preparation was greatly reduced. And what they were doing, remember we talked about how when the Muslims first started their century of conquest, one of the ways that worked was because both the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire were hiring these tribal people as mercenaries to sort of fight each other and fight on their behalf. The Byzantines were relying more and more and more on that mercenary way of conducting their military business, shall we say. And they're also relying on the Venetians and other Italian cities to do their naval business for them. And so they don't have a lot of resources to put into this fight, which is part of how the territories were lost in the first place. So the Romans were not wrong when they said these guys can't hack it. If these territories are going to be recovered, we have to go and do it. Also, I think the Byzantines had 3 centuries of fighting with the Muslims. They had a much less unrealistic picture of how easy that would be. So the Western Christians were like, oh, these guys are infidels, we can wipe them up, easily. And the Byzantines were like, listen, we fought these guys. We know what that's like. And the Europeans knew nothing about, warfare in a climate like the Middle East climate. They died. I mean, for every one that died of anything that happened in battle, like 10 of them died from diseases and heat stroke. And I mean, it was awful. So I think the Byzantines were sort of like, yeah, okay, let us know how that goes, and we'll come and help you out with the last part of it. And also, I think the Romans were not particularly interested at this point in Byzantine help, because they were all about the ego of doing it themselves, and as a way of demonstrating that, hey, we've got God's ears because we're doing this Christianity thing right, and you guys are not, and that's why you have never succeeded, right? So for all of those reasons, I think that and there were times when the Byzantines did not so much sending help, but they were a lot closer. So you could sail out of Constantinople also and get to the Holy Land more easily than from a French port, for instance. So there will be later crusades, because it's not, in fact, one and done, where they will sail from Constantinople. And that is part of what's going to get us in trouble, as we'll see here in a minute. So does that help understand what's going on with the Byzantines at this point? Okay. All right. Any other sort of, I don't get it, kind of, okay. So the next thing that happens is in 1182. So it's about 80 years, and those 80 years from about 1100 to about 1180, that's the golden age of the Crusader kingdoms. That's the time when they actually think that they might make this work. And by 1187, Jerusalem falls to the Muslims again. So they get a little less than 100 years for that to for them to really be in charge in that area. Now they'll hang out in some of the other Crusader kingdoms for another 100 years. So it's almost 200 years between the first crusade and the last one. But a lot goes on in the meantime. So, for instance, in 1182, there is what's known as the Massacre of the Latins. And when you hear Latins, think Western European Christians in Constantinople. And the reason this happens is what I was just talking about, that there are a number of people who today we would call Italians. They thought of themselves as Venetians or Pisans or Genoese or people from Amalfi, but they had a very large expatriate community living in Constantinople, okay? And the reason for this is that the Italians, especially the lower southern Italians, were great sailors, because that's how they made their money. They didn't have that great of an agricultural opportunity. As we know, Rome was largely fed from ship imported food. So they were good at that. They were good shipbuilders, and they were good sailors, and they made great navies. So the way that Constantinople dealt with the disorganization and corruption in their own military was to hire these Italians and give them trade concessions, so that they would say, you can be the importers of all the things that are going to get imported to the city by sea. You own the ships, you sail them, you bring your stuff, and you can sell it here, at a monopoly price, or, without import taxes or whatever. The government was giving very favorable rates for trade. And then they would also hire these Italians to be their navy if they actually needed a naval force for anything. They didn't really maintain much of one themselves. They counted on being able to hire these same people if there was naval warfare coming. These Latins were quite unpopular with a lot of the common people in Constantinople because the Italians looked down on them as being uncultured because they couldn't sail and they couldn't organize their way out of paper bag. Plus, the Latins had a lot of money because they were making good money, both through trade and through being hired as mercenary sailors. For a lot of complicated reasons, in 1182, there was an uprising of common people against a ruler. Well, let's see if I can do this. The prince, the secular prince of Constantinople, had married a Latin princess as a way of trying to cement an alliance. He died, and she, in her regency for their infant son, favored the Latin merchants because they were her country people. I mean, they spoke the same language, so to speak. And she was apparently, I don't know, extravagant or unpopular for whatever reason. So when the city rose up against her, they were also rising up against the other expatriate Latins who were living in the city. And they all lived in one quarter. So sort of like there was a Jewish quarter, and, you know, so it was fairly easy to overpower people, get into that quarter, burn their homes, loot their homes, because they had all these, you know, the artifacts of being rich people. And many of them were killed, like tens of thousands of them were killed, and 4,000 of them who survived were sold into slavery. Now, keep in mind that the Latins were practicing Roman Christianity, right? And so there was also a religious difference there. And so once the Pope in the West and the Western Christians heard about this, that was one of the things that cemented the decision of 1054, that, you know, they slaughtered our people. You know, we're not going to be in religious communion with them. They're obviously evil, right? So that massacre in 1182, that it's only 5 years after that then Jerusalem falls again to the Muslims. And then 20 years later, not even, you get the Fourth Crusade. And the Fourth Crusade is both better organized, but more of a disaster than the First Crusade, because the Fourth Crusade is, oops, okay, they got it back, we need to go get it back again. Right, that's the motivation behind the Fourth Crusade. It's we're going to rescue Jerusalem again. But this time, and it's still, the Pope is calling it again. He didn't call all the Crusades, but he called this one. And he's going to get this guy Boniface of Montferrat to lead it, and they're going to send 33,000 fighting men, and I forget, it was like 4,000 knights and X number of horses and all that. Back to the Holy Land to once again recapture Jerusalem, right? Great idea. Remember last time we tried this, we didn't have enough ships. Let's make sure that doesn't happen again. Okay, who builds ships? The Venetians build ships. They're really good at it. They love doing it. For a price, they'll build you all the ships you want. Okay, fine. We will contract with the Venetians to build us, and I forget what it was, like 450 cargo ships and 150 battleships or something. Like it was this huge armada. And the Venetians said, all right, we're putting everything else on hold for a year. It's going to take us a year. We're putting everything else on hold, all our trading, all our building for anything else. We'll build you this armada, these ships. Okay, so then the Crusaders start to arrive. First of all, not all of them decided to sail out of Venice. Some of them took ship in Arles or other places, and said, yeah, we'll see you over there, kind of thing. So by the time everybody assembles in Venice to collect these ships and pay for them, there's not 33,000 of them, there's maybe 12,000 of them. And they cannot pay the price that was promised to the Venetians for putting everything else aside and concentrating on this for a year. And the Venetians are like, well, you're not sailing off in our ships without paying for them. We don't care if you are the Pope. You know, that's not the deal. So they're like, well, what are we going to do? And the ones who were there, they all melted down their golden spurs and all their ornaments and stuff, and they still didn't have enough to pay for this. So the Venetian says, okay, we will make a deal with you. Here you are with an army. We got ships. Okay, great. We want you to sail over to the city of Zara, which has traditionally been under our control. And they recently tried to declare their independence and they tossed us out as administrators. We want to, you retake that city for us and we'll call it even for the ships, right? Well, the Crusaders can't do much else because they can't get to the Holy Land without the ships. So they're like, oh, okay, all right, we'll do that first. So they get in all these ships and they sail over to Zara and they take back Zara. And it's November at that point. And so they say, well, you know what? We really don't want to do this crossing until we get good weather again. So let's just spend the winter here in Zara. So that's what they do. And while they're sitting around in Zara, this guy Boniface of Montferrat has a cousin that he's visiting in one of the Balkan countries. And while he's there, he meets this guy who says to him, my father was the emperor of Constantinople, and he got deposed by his evil brother. So my evil uncle is now running Constantinople. And since you have this fighting force that isn't doing anything, and you still need money, because even if they've cleared the debt on the ships, they now have no money for anything else. They've got no money for food or, you know, paying people's wages or feeding the horses or anything else. He says, and his name is unwieldy, and I'm sorry I didn't write it down. But anyway, this guy says to Boniface, if you will put me back on the throne of Constantinople, I will repay your debt to the Venetians. I will fund your entire expedition. I will give you more money to hire more troops, and I will see to it that the Bishop of Constantinople submits to the Pope in Rome. You know, I will give you this thing that you've always wanted in terms of the church hierarchy. You know, whether or not he had the authority to say any of those things remains to be seen. But Boniface says, well, that sounds like a great deal. We'll get the whole thing paid for. And, you know, the taking Zara was not that big a deal. You know, we'll go take this other city, and then our debts will be cleared and we'll have lots of money and we'll sail to Jerusalem and everything will be great. Now, meanwhile, a number of the vowed crusaders, a number of them sailed directly, didn't come through Venice, so they didn't participate in this. A number of people since Zara have said, listen, we think we can get over there. We'll meet you over there. So they've left, they've gone ahead. To Cyprus mostly is where they went. So this is not the whole of even the diminished force that arrived in Venice to start with. But they decide that they're going to do this. And while the Pope in Rome has forbidden them to harm other Christians, the Pope in Rome is not going to discourage them very hard from trying to implement this deal by which he gets recognized as the supreme authority in both churches, right? So they sail back to Constantinople They sail to Constantinople. In June of 2003, they besiege the city, and the evil uncle flees from the city. It doesn't take much to dislodge him. He knows which side his bread is buttered on. So he leaves. Meanwhile, the dad of this guy who made all these promises, he's still alive and kicking. So what do when the evil uncle flees? They give the crown back to dad. Well, dad didn't have any part in this bargain that was made by Junior. And so he's like, I don't have that kind of money. I can't make the bishop defer to the Pope. That wasn't me. So now the Crusaders are mad, and they're like, okay, we are not leaving here. We haven't really done anything except threaten the city. Okay. But we are not leaving here until Junior is made co-emperor and pays up on what he promised us, right? And so, in fact, Junior is installed in that fall, and he starts negotiating about when he can get the money and when he can do all this stuff that he promised. In January, dad dies. So now Sonny is the full emperor, and it's like, okay, where's our money? And not getting it, then the Crusaders decide, okay, this is a rich city. You got lots of stuff. We're just going to sack the city and take what we want. Well, the problem is, of course, that evil uncle took a bunch of the ready cash and jewels and stuff when he fled. And the city's been misadministered for so long that there really aren't that many resources there anyway. So that means that when the Crusaders actually break into the city, which isn't that easy to do because Constantinople is easy to defend, they actually break in, there isn't that much there. And so that's when they start stealing the art or destroying the art. And that's the really sad thing about it, is they didn't make off with as much as they just wrecked because it was too big or they couldn't figure out how to make off with it. So that's in April of 1204. And so after that, some of them just decide to go home. They decide they've had enough of this. So of the 92 knights who did actually take the vow and leave home to go on this crusade, it was only somewhere between 23 and 26, depending on who you identify, that actually get as far as the city of Acre to actually undertake this crusade. And they don't actually recover Jerusalem, but some of them, when they get there, they set up these little, or I'm sorry, the ones who go don't actually succeed in taking Jerusalem. The ones who don't go are left with this sacked city, right? And so once again, who's going to be in charge? Well, we're going to be in charge, because we're here and we took the city. So they set up these little Latin kingdoms all around Constantinople in Byzantine territory. And the Turks, the Muslim Turks, make short work of most of them. I mean, they don't even survive the first generation, let alone find some sort of succession plan. The citizens of Nicaea actually reconquer Constantinople in 1261. So it's about 50 years, a little more, that they're there. And after that, in 1453, so about 200 years later, it falls to Muslim control. Constantinople does, without really ever rising from those ashes as a city or an international power again. So if the massacre of the Latins made it hard for the Western Church to ever think about reconciling, the sack of Constantinople makes it hard for the Eastern Church to ever think about reconciling. And that really puts the final brick in the wall between the two churches. And just to bring us full circle, 1271 is the 8th and final crusade, which accomplishes nothing. And the fall of Acre, which is north of Jerusalem, was the last holdout of those crusader kingdoms, and was sort of their base of operations once they lost Jerusalem. That falls in 1291, and that's considered the end of the Crusades. Yeah, Peggy and then Anna.
What was the Children's Crusade?
Oh God, that was earlier. That was, I think it's like the 4th one. I could look it up, but it was this craziness of people having experienced a couple of crusades and their failures due to the disorganization and the cupidity of the people who went by. After the first one, it became more of a like, send your second sons or send your troublesome brother-in-law, or if the reason you want to go on crusade is because you need to be forgiven from some serious sin, you may not be a model citizen to begin with. And people would go because they were greedy, because they wanted to bring back loot. So there was this sense of, okay, this isn't working because we're not sending truly pious, righteous people. And so the pagan powers would fall before the truly righteous soldiers of God. And who is more truly righteous than children? And so it was not mostly little kids. It was mostly like teens and preteens. But I mean, they were everything that you would worry about happening to a kid trying to march across Europe happened to them. They never got anywhere near the actual Holy Land. But it was a kind of fanaticism, I guess you would say, that this would work if only it was blessed enough, and how could God not bless these children? Well, obviously he could choose not to. So
Okay.
Yes.
So all the crusades, all of them were about Jerusalem.
No, well, yes and no. I mean, if you think of a specific crusade as being a particular group that gathered in Europe and went or tried to go to the Holy Land, they were all motivated by the idea of Jerusalem, and the idea that, well, once it had fallen, getting it back. But even before that, of reinforcing that this is now permanently the property of the Western Christian Church. And because all this whole time, the Muslims are like, this is ridiculous, out of here. I mean, they're constantly trying to get them out. And so there's always need for reinforcements. And the thing is, it's like the seasonal concept with the soldiers in Spain. You would vow to go on crusade for a year and a day, or 2 years and a day, or whatever the period of time. Once that was done, your vow was fulfilled. Whether or not you actually succeeded in your military objective, you get home. And in some cases, these were people who had dukedoms or kingdoms, that were like, hey, are you coming home anytime soon? So that was part of what made the administration really walky, because you couldn't count on who was going to stick around for any like this. So you had to have a constant stream of new people, plus of which they died like flies once they got there, because they couldn't deal with the diseases and they couldn't deal with the climate, and some of them actually were able to get themselves killed in battle. So there was a constant need for reinforcements to try to keep Jerusalem. But if you were there, if you were in Jerusalem, if you were in Acre, if you were on Cyprus, where you had some access to the whole scene, you might have a little more sophisticated understanding. Okay, we need to go and reinforce Antioch because, that's the place that's the most threatened. Or we would really love to go and take Alexandria back because it's part of our 5-part system here. Or so there were sort of sub-objectives that people had from time to time in that struggle. But when a pope was summoning a crusade, it was usually about the holy city and the Holy Land. So, the area around Jerusalem where Jesus lived. That was the point. Yeah, Elle. And then
Didn't the Crusaders do a lot of other horrible things on the way there? Like
right. Well,
they-
that's why I say it was very expensive to go on crusade, and not everybody could afford to do it themselves. So one of the things you could do, if you couldn't go yourself, you could sponsor someone else and pay for them to go. But people would also say, okay, I have this horrible sin to forgive, or I need whatever, I'm going to go on crusade. And they would just make a vow and set out and assume that, somehow they were going to get there and someone was going to put a sword in their hand. It was very catch as catch can. And so, yes, they, on their way through France and Germany and Italy and so on, that, they often felt entitled to be fed by the, local, wherever they were passing through. I'm a crusader was kind of a big deal. So yes, forces would sometimes invade cities or towns and force them to supply them. Plus, not all of these people were nice people, let's go kill somebody is not the best rallying cry for the nicer people in your environment. So they were not necessarily nice to start out with, and they got themselves in over their heads, and they felt entitled. So for all of those reasons, yes, they often did awful things. Who else? Kay? Yeah.
What were the Jerusalem Jews doing during all of this? Were they still in Jerusalem?
They were, they were like Christians. They were regarded by the Muslims as people of the book. Muhammad drew a lot of his practice from the Jewish tradition. And although he ended up feeling like the Jews had betrayed him in a way that he didn't feel that Christians had betrayed him, but still, he left lots of instructions about treating them well. And in the same way that Jerusalem was a pilgrimage site for Christians, it was, of course, a pilgrimage site for Jews. And that also was an economic incentive to not treat them badly. But also remember that the Jewish community was to some extent dispersed. The Muslims were not inviting them to rebuild their temple. They were welcome to live there, but there was no possibility that Israel was going to resume its glory as long as it was occupied by Muslims, right? So there wasn't a big motivation for Jews to assemble there. If it was sort of where your family always was, maybe you stayed. But you paid the tax, and you sort of kept your head down. I think maybe catered to the tourist trade. I don't know. But I'm sure there's literature about the Jewish community in Jerusalem during the Crusades. It'd be fascinating study. Yeah, Anna.
Just so since the Western Christians had Rome as their center, religious center,
Right.
once Constantinople was whatever, not Constantinople, what did the Eastern Christians, where were they centered? Did they go to Rome or?
After the fall of Constantinople, you mean? Well, that is a great question to which I only know this much of the answer. That's why you have the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, it's splintered up into all these little national churches because there was no center anymore. That's right. But exactly how that unfolded, I'm sure would be fascinating, but I don't know enough. Yeah, Peggy.
It's also why you have the Renaissance in Western Europe, because
Right.
many of them fled west to
Mhm.
Rome.
Mhm,
Well, not necessarily to Rome. Many of them fled to Florence in
mhm.
Italy and Siena and other Italian cities, and brought with them a lot of ancient texts and
Right.
ideas and learning that wasn't, including the Greek language, which wasn't that well known in Italy. So
Right.
anyway, they dispersed in a lot of
Yes.
places, but it really had an effect on Europe.
The intellectuals
Right.
particularly came west. To, but when they came west, they didn't particularly, that I'm aware of, bring the religious practice. You know, it's not like they came to Italy and set up Byzantine churches so much as they set up schools and trading and stuff like that. So
Right.
the idea of the Byzantine church remained an Eastern kind of proposition, I think.
They mainly brought Plato and Aristotle.
Yes, right.
And
Makes
it's
sense.
when the Medici set up the academies and the like.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the other piece of the Renaissance, and we'll get there, I'll let you go in just one second. That shipping that the Southern Italians were doing is also a key to the Renaissance, because it was their widespread trade that necessitated the resurgence of conversational and contractual Latin, which made them go back to the classical texts, because church Latin wasn't very useful for that. But Latin as a living language, as it was spoken by the pre-Christian Romans, that was useful as a lingua franca for all of those trading. So, and because of that, then they rediscovered the ancient philosophers and scholars, and that also helped to fuel the Renaissance. So, yeah, that's a piece of it. Sue, did you have a question? Did I miss you? Okay. All
I
right.
have
Yes. No.
one quick.
Yeah.
When did the plague start?
The 1300s. So we're
1300. So
getting
it's
there.
after this.
Yeah, right. Shortly after this. Yeah. And this trade is also part of why you get the plague,
Yeah.
because it comes out of North
Genoa.
Africa, we think, to Europe through the Italian trading. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. That was a big chunk to get through. And next week, we may look a little more at what's going on in Spain and how that all comes to an end.
Will be good.
Thank you so much, Kendall.
Oh,
Thank
you're
you. It was
welcome. So
really
good to
great
see you.
today. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
One of the biggest things I've learned from this class is that it wasn't just one central thing, and that so much culture happened because of the differences.